God is indescribable, amazing. God leads us out across the oceans to places where our feet may not wander, to places we cannot stand. The possibilities in our relationship with God are unlimited. The possibilities for healing of relationships, for fulfilling our purpose, for living meaningful lives, for having the assurance of God's love in all situations. The question is, are we listening? Are we paying attention to what's possible? Or are we so captivated and captured by the ways and the limits of the world that we can't hear the possibilities that are before us? This is the second in our series on the ways of love. And the second way of love is listening. Listening is powerful. We've heard that before. Listening is the key to being a great musician, according to saxophonist Matthew Willis. You know, there's a whole lot of players out there that can hit all the right notes with great technique. Matt says that in any given piece, there may be 10 or 15 different ways he could go. But the key, he says, is listening to the music. He's found that if he can fully enter in and allow the music and be with the music and then allow his instincts to lead him and guide him into that which he should bring the right nuance for the right moment. And it's true for teaching. You know, if you're a good teacher, if you've got a lot of information at your disposal, if you've done your preparation, you've got a lot to say. But what's the difference between a teacher who just drones on with a lot of irrelevant facts that nobody's interested in and a teacher that's dynamic and powerful and speaks to the hearts and transforms lives? It's the teacher who's also listening, who knows the students, who knows the context, and is able to make the connection between the context and the words. Listening is key to love. All of us just want to be heard, don't we? More than advice. I mean, advice can be helpful sometimes, but advice is not always what we need. Sometimes we just need to be heard. And sometimes the solution to what we're dealing with is already in our souls. And all we need is that space to be listened to allow the wisdom of our souls to speak. So we're going to go deep into listening today. In this short passage in Luke's Gospel, Jesus talks about listening 3 times. First of all, he says, if you have ears to hear, listen. There's a lot of wisdom here. There's a lot of truth. There's a lot of transformative teaching. But if you have ears to hear, listen, because you might miss it. In the second place, he says, how many of us hear but we can't understand? We're listening but we're not actually hearing. And then finally in the conclusion he says, pay attention to how you hear. So what we're going to learn today is how to hear. Jesus is going to talk to us about how to listen in the reign of God, in the way of God. And he tells us a parable that kind of underscores and illustrates the point. The sower goes out to sow. A farmer, typical, talking to farmers, talking about farming. If he was talking to us, he'd be talking about riding the subway, or talking about our workspace, or talking about what's going on in our neighborhoods. But he's talking their language. He's telling them what they already understand. A sower goes out to sow, and some of the seed falls on the path and doesn't yield anything, and some of the seed falls in rocky soil, and it springs up, but then it withers away because it has no root. And some of the seed falls among thorns, and it grows, but the weeds choke it out. And the farmers are just nodding their heads, of course. That's the way our lives are. Because these are poor farmers. They don't have the fertile lands that are all owned by the rich landowners. They're trying to eke out a living on the sides of the mountain. And so Jesus is talking to farmers who know what it is that your seed lies in rocky soil, that your seed gets among the thorn, that it doesn't produce. These farmers are lucky to get food on the table. They're desperate. And Jesus is speaking about their lives. But he says, listen. If you have ears to hear, listen. When seed gets in good soil, it produces 30 and 60 and 100-fold. The abundance is limitless. Now, we've looked at this passage in many different ways, but today I'm really picking up on Jesus talking to us about listening. Are you hearing what's happening? Are we listening? What kinds of conversations are we having? Are we listening to God? Are we hearing the voice of God in the midst of all the chaos and clutter of the world and realizing what's possible? What's a conversation look like when the seed lands on the path, the well-worn path? How many of us have conversations where we already know what the other person is thinking? We're not even listening anymore. I remember when my younger daughter was a teenager, we went through a little phase where I would tell her something and she said, "Daddy, I knew you were going to say that." We become so predictable in our relationships. It can be with our spouse. It can be a longtime friend. It can be our relationships with our children, where we've just become so familiar that we're not even hearing each other anymore. We're just kind of going through the motions. Can real relationship exist on the well-worn path? Well, next Jesus talks about seed that gets in rocky soil. It springs up, but there's no root, and so it quickly dies out. Conversations that have no commitment behind them. You know, we can say some words, we can get all excited in a conversation, and you've had these kind of conversations before. Oh, I'm going to change this. This is going to be different. This is going to possible. We're going to make this happen. But there's no commitment of action to the words. And so that what ends up happening is nothing actually comes of the conversation. And if we have enough of those conversations with somebody, then pretty soon we're just throwing words around and we realize that there's no actual transformation happening in the words. Well, what about conversations that get amidst the thorns? Jesus talks specifically about the cares of the world. The intention is there, the desire is there to make change, but the cares of the world are so overwhelming in our lives that the young seedlings of this possibility get choked out by the thorns. I had a long series of conversations with a young man at a previous church. This was one of the brightest of the brightest. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood. He had gotten himself in trouble. He was in juvenile detention by the age of 15. But he came out of juvenile detention. He was determined to make it work in his life. So he left his parents' home and he moved over to his grandmother's home. She lived in a different part of town. It was going to give him a new start, get away from all that trouble. And he started studying, applying himself. He did really well. He went to Morehouse College, got his degree. He went to Harvard. He got his degree in law school. I mean, he was moving along. And all during this time, we would be having conversations. He would come to the church. We would pray. He would get down on his knees and we would pray. And he had a calling from God. God was calling him to work in his community, to work with young folks who had gotten in the kind of trouble he had, to use his law expertise to make a real difference for people who couldn't otherwise afford it. But first he had to pay off his law school debts. So for 2 years he was going to take a job with a corporate law firm. Well, that was 12 years ago. And he's still there. Couldn't get away. Because, you know, they helped him pay off his debts, but in the meantime, you know, he was going with the partners to look at the penthouse suites and to begin to see what that lifestyle could bring. And the longer he was in it, the more he got into it. And the last conversation with him I had just about 3 years ago, he's working for some kind of company that deals with gambling casinos in Mexico or something, but he's making a ton of money. But, you know, I mentioned to him, man, what about your dream? What happened to that dream? What happened to that calling that you had from God? He didn't even want to talk about it. I said, come on, let's get together and talk someone. He gave him my card. He didn't even want to talk anymore. You know, the thorns of the ways of the world can grab us and they can steal our dreams with false promises. They can give us hopes and glimmering dreams that take away the heart of the dream that God has given us and the seed doesn't grow. It gets drowned out by the thorns. But what about the good soil? Jesus says that when seed gets in good soil, that it produces. Not just 7-fold, not just 10-fold, but 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. Now the farmers are starting to get excited now. I mean, 7-fold is what they might usually expect. That could help them keep food on the table. But 30-fold, that could help them pay off their debts. And 60-fold, that might be able to help them send their children to college. And 100-fold, this is life-transforming kind of stuff that Jesus is putting out. When the seed lands in good soil, all kinds of healing and transformation can happen in our lives. There's limitless possibilities. It's hard for us to get to that good soil because we're so inundated with the rocks and the thorns. I mean, we live in a society where there is no listening, where the people hear, but their ears have grown heavy and they're not even hearing the message anymore. We got people that are all excited about Donald Trump, for God's sake. Spewing a message of scapegoating, of picking groups of people, blaming them for our social problems. We've gotten to a place where we can't even hear each other anymore. We want to use each other for political ends. Jesus invites us into the way of God. He's very clear that there's a difference between listening in the way of the world and listening in the way of God. In the way of God, in the good soil, we are not listening for the same old story. We are not listening for the stereotyping and scapegoating. We are not listening for the easy solutions. We are open to 30 and 60 and 100-fold. It's a mind shift. It's a worldview shift. And it's all about faith. It's trusting that God can take us to a place that we haven't even imagined yet. That God can do for us far more abundantly than anything we can think or imagine. When we can get ourselves in that conversation of good soil, things change. So how does that happen? I've been reading a book by a guy named Parker Palmer called about wholeness, about what it is to reclaim our wholeness. And in that book he talks about circles of trust. And this is where faith community really begins to come in. We can have a different kind of conversation in the context of faith community that can transform us and even transform our conversations outside. In the circle of trust, there is no advice given. The purpose is solely to listen to one another, to establish an environment where our souls feel safe enough to speak their truth. You see, most of the time our souls don't feel safe enough to speak their truth. We feel vulnerable. We're afraid to say who we really are. We're afraid to say what we really dream because we don't feel that it's going to be received with a fullness. We're casting our pearls out there. We're putting the depths of our souls out there. All of us have these dreams in our souls. But can we create an environment where we can begin to share with one another from the depths of our souls? Share with one another our truth. And trust that it's going to be respected and received in a nurturing environment that's going to allow us to grow. Once we can establish that kind of trust, the kind of transformation, the 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold that Jesus is talking about is going to be open. Pay attention, Jesus says, to the way you listen. How do we listen to one another? Do you listen to somebody expecting that you already know what they're going to say? Or are you listening to someone for transformation? Can you listen to someone ready to be surprised? Like that seed that got in good soil and grew up 30 and 60 and 100-fold. In the circles of trust, it may take some time. It may not happen in a day. It may be over time that the trust begins to build, that we begin to realize that we can share our truth with one another. And as we guard the safety of that circle, by not trying to advise each other, by not trying to judge each other, but by really trusting that the seed that God has placed within us can grow and can give us the wisdom we need. In October, we're going to begin a new experiment here, and we're preparing for it now. The conversation circles we have are awesome ways that at the end of worship, we not only get to sit and listen, but we also get to speak, and other people listen to us. We have a chance to share with one another. We want to take those conversation circles to the next level. So the experiment is that beginning in October, we're going to invite us to stay in the same circle over a period of time, over a period of months. Now, it's going to take a little logistical. We're going to have to work it through and make it work. It may take a few weeks to get it together. And the key is going to be a group of facilitators facilitating those circles. And we're in this right now. We're beginning to meet monthly with facilitators who will be leading these circles and establishing the kind of trust that's going to allow us over a period of weeks and months to begin to share in these healing and transforming kind of ways. So I want to invite anyone who may be feeling called by God to facilitate conversations that lead to 30, 60, and 100-fold abundance. That feel called to be with a group of people and to care with them, to care for them over a period of time, to notice who's here, who may be sick, and really begin to develop a circle of caring. I want to invite you to put that on your communication card later in the service, and we'll have more conversation. I want to invite us to just take a moment. Take a deep breath and open yourself to the possibility of listening to God. Open yourself to the possibility that even in the midst of something that's not going well, that God may be speaking to you. Even in the midst of some situation that seems really awkward and uncomfortable, that God may have a message for you. That even in the midst of a job situation that's not working well, even in the midst of a relationship that's frustrating you, that God may have a message for you, and that if you're able to hear it, it might be transforming. What would it be like if we were listening for the voice of God in conversations that we're having? What would it be like when you're talking to your spouse or your child or your friend or your coworker, that instead of just expecting to hear the same old on the well-worn path, that you were actually listening intently for the possibilities of healing and transformation? The way we hear each other, Jesus says, makes a difference in that transformation. We can be allies with one another. We're all called to change. We're all called to heal. We're all called to be transformed. And we're called to do that in community. We can be with one another. We can walk with one another on this journey. We can be a community of faith that is creating an environment where we can be healed and transformed. Gracious God, what is the word that you have for us today? As we bring to mind a relationship that's been a little frustrating for us, a relationship that maybe we have some anxieties around, what are you saying to us? What is the possibility there? As we call to mind, O God, our work situation, in one particular aspect of it that's got us a little bit frustrated right now. What is the word that you're saying to us? What is the way that you're making forward? Oh God, we open ourselves to the ways that we listen. Amen.